Hello everyone. Persona 3 Reload is a very controversial game. Supposedly being the definitive version of Persona 3, it left a lot to be desired. While a lot of people's gripes are on the watered down nature of Reload somehow makes Reload feels too much like Persona 5, my personal main gripe on Persona 3 Reload is the gameplay, that the game is way too easy. Persona games didn't really have a track record of being difficult games. However, Persona 3 was notorious to be one of the hardest entries, even arguably amongst other Shin Megami Tensei games. So, some level of whiplash or shock do play a factor in Persona 3 Reload being not a challenging game at all. That being said, through all of the multiple combat and gameplay systems, one of the main reasons that I think Persona 3 Reload is not a difficult or challenging game is the implementation of the Theurgy System. The Theurgy System is a new combat feature added in Persona 3 Reload. It introduces new sets of skills and passives for all party members using a new Theurgy gauge resource separate from HP or SP. While crawling in Tartarus, your characters will passively fill this Theurgy gauge slowly through actions like melee attack and casting persona skills. Additionally, each character had a specific condition to make those gauge increase faster, unique to those characters. For example, Akihiko is one of the characters that benefits the most from this. His tooltip says, after strengthening himself, his fighting spirit rises. Wonky description aside, this actually means if Akihiko had an active buff at the start of his turn, his Theurgy gauge increases, heavily increasing his Theurgy gauge gain. Another example is Junpei, for gaining Theurgy gauge whenever he lands a critical strike with his physical attacks. When the Theurgy gauge is filled up, that character will gain the ability to cast a Theurgy skill, with most characters having an option out of 2 Theurgy skill, while the protagonist gains up to 7 Theurgy skills unlockable by your Persona Compendium. Theurgy skills can include buffing or healing skills, but typically they are massive offensive skills that deal huge amounts of damage and pierces enemies' resistances. I think it's pretty obvious where the power spike and the reason why Theurgy in general could trivialize the game's difficulty. So, what's the purpose of Theurgy being added in Persona 3 Reload? From what I can tell, there are several reasons for this. Number 1, the nature of Theurgy being tailored around specific gimmicks across different characters, it encourages players to use specific characters to play in a specific playstyle. Take Akihiko again, for example. Because Akihiko benefits from getting buffs, Akihiko would be great in a party that plays around buffing your party members. Another example is pairing Koromaru with another physical-based party member, because Koromaru has a Theurgy that gives all of your party members the charge effect, more than doubling their next physical damage dealt. There are other multiple different ways to build and play with your party members according to your playstyle, and Theurgy strengthens and encourages those kinds of playstyle to a certain degree. Number 2, due to the usual SP drought phenomenon in Persona games, where you would frequently run out of SP in dungeons, Theurgy in a sense could be a solution to the SP drought problem, albeit in a very indirect and roundabout way, purely because Theurgy skills do not cost SP, but only the Theurgy gauge. It can be used to save SP for a few turns per night. Surely it won't be a lot of SP saved, but it can save you from difficult situations. Like for example, magic-based party members won't ultimately be locked out of doing anything other than melee attacking because they can still have a fighting chance relying on the Theurgy system. Or simply saving Theurgy for difficult Tartarus bosses. And number 3, the Theurgy system simply just looks cool. With how much analysis that I will do, it should be mentioned that in the end, the ultimate purpose of these systems attached to Persona 3 Reload is that they look cool. With all of those benefits of why the Theurgy system is added to Persona 3 Reload, it creates problems with the gameplay experience, making Persona 3 Reload sometimes a lukewarm experience. I could only think of 4 at the moment, and I'm pretty sure there could be more problems than what I will lay out. But here are the problems that I think the Theurgy system creates. Problem number 1, Theurgy skills are too powerful for virtually no cost. Theurgy skills only cost Theurgy gauge, which will regenerate passively as you play normally, with melee attacks, casting persona skills, or fulfilling gauge conditions, making the Theurgy gauge technically not a finite resource that you will juggle while playing, unlike HP or SP. So as long as you can refill your Theurgy gauge in a long run of Tartarus, there's no end to casting Theurgys over and over again. In contrast to skills that cost SP, at one point you'll reach that soft limit where you run out of SP, run out of items to restore SP, in which the best decision is to end the night to fully refill HP and SP. On top of that, Theurgy skills are typically strong as well. Normally the offensive ones are very strong because they deal lots of damage while also ignoring resistances. Problem number 2. Enemies in Persona 3 Reload feels as if they are not scaled up in consideration of the Theurgy system being added to Persona 3 Reload. So, based on my personal first playthrough of Persona 3 Reload, I played on Merciless with an Act Freely challenge added. The result is that the first few hours were pretty challenging but manageable, but it gets insanely easy at a certain point of the game, and it never picks up in difficulty after that. That certain point is when I unlock some of the powerful Theurgies available, and also when I started to grow faster in levels than the enemies in Tartarus with the level catch-up mechanic and the increased overall EXP gain from the Showtime system. I have a suspicion that the enemies in Persona 3 Reload were copied from the previous versions of Persona 3, and their difficulty and stats weren't balanced to compensate for whatever systems we got in Persona 3 Reload. I don't actually know the full details in that, but even if they did balance some stuffs here and there, I think it's not enough. So as a result, enemies don't pose any challenge, as they get left behind in overall power. However, thinking about it, this is more so of a result of the first point, that Theurgy is too powerful that no matter how much they balance the enemy's difficulty to compensate for the Theurgy system addition, it's never going to be enough. Problem number 3. Some Theurgies are not worth casting, or straight up not interesting in a sense that the usage of the other option of Theurgy skill is much more beneficial than the first one. Now, this is much more arguable and opinionated depending on each player's playstyle, but to me, some Theurgy skills can pose as not impressive, while some of the others are highly impressive that the lackluster ones don't really get a chance to get into the spotlight. For me, one of the best examples of this is Ken, with his Theurgy gauge condition. His gauge condition is somewhat interesting actually. At the start of his turn, if he has less than half SP, the Theurgy gauge will increase significantly, making Ken an interesting gimmick character that encourages to spend SP to less than half remaining and hovers around that area of SP. However, with a pool of expensive skills and Ken's main role being a healer, frugally spending SP to less than half his SP pool in order to activate his Theurgy gimmick, it is more of a detriment than it is helpful, as Ken became a one-and-done character that won't last very long in combat due to his low SP. This makes sense if Ken was mainly used as a magic damage dealer, but considering that Ken is also a healer right next to Yukari, his kit feels counterintuitive. Because of that, I could just use Yukari instead as a healer because she's a lot better designed and executed as the healer support unit. Yukari's Theurgy gauge condition is by casting healing spells. That's it, no strings attached. So as long as she does her job consistently to heal your party members, she'll get her Theurgy gauge pretty quickly. Not to mention as well that she has a passive that reduces SP cost of all healing skills up to 75%, meaning that she'll only spend a fourth of the normal SP cost of healing skills, making her able to cast more healing skills, which feeds back to her Theurgy gauge. And the Theurgy skill she had is nothing to scoff at, other than the usual high damage skill that pierces resistances. Her second Theurgy allows her to give all party members the concentrate effect, allowing all of your party members to deal more than double the damage for their next magic attack, which can be paired with other Theurgy skills to deal huge amounts of damage. Needless to say, Yukari is hands down the best healer / support party member in Persona 3 Reload, because her kit paired with her Theurgy is well designed, well executed, and also powerful. In contrast to Ken's kit, while his kit is interesting at best, he lacks the quote-unquote oomph to compete with Yukari as the other healer. His kit might stand a chance if we're looking at the magic damage dealer side of his kit, but nevertheless, it still needs some attention. And the last problem that I can think about, there's basically no reason to not use Theurgy. Of course, Theurgies have to have a reason to be casted. Why would they implement it anyway if I want a reason to not use Theurgy? What I mean by this is because Theurgy skills did not cost anything other than the Theurgy gauge, they are also too powerful, and the Theurgy gauge will regenerate anyway the longer you play, there's no reason to not use them whenever you get the chance to do so. The Theurgy system doesn't seem to have any downsides that strategies in Persona 3 Reload feels like it has to be revolving around the Theurgy systems of each character. Player expression is important in building characters. Even if characters in Persona typically have a set of preset playstyle per character, some leeway can be made that people would rather use instead of the usual ones. One example that I can think of is Mitsuru with her kit. In Persona 3 Portable, Mitsuru can either be a versatile magic damage dealer with status ailments in her kit, or a more favorable magic damage dealer that removes ailments in her kit and go for big ice damage with Ice Amp, plus boost, and Mind Charge. In Persona 3 Reload, because of Mitsuru's Theurgy gauge condition is all about debuff and ailments, it feels like it's better that Mitsuru keeps a debuff and an ailment skill, at least one each, which sacrifices some skill slots for an optimal magic damage dealer build. But because Theurgy is so strong that it feels like it is necessary to play around that, it is better to use Mitsuru that has skill slots constrained for a better consistency of her Theurgy. Normally, with all of the problems laid out like this, I would go straight to my suggested solutions for how Theurgy can be made better. However, I think it is best to also introduce to what I think is the blueprint or the inspiration of the Theurgy mechanic present in the previous Persona game, Persona 5 Royal, with their system called Showtime. With how much it focuses on the cool aspect of a stylish, character-based attack, these systems seems comparable to each other, yet Showtime didn't pose a lot of problems for Persona 5 Royal as much as Theurgy is a problem for Persona 3 Reload. Even though I included Showtime in the title, Showtime is a much more positive inclusion in Persona 5 Royal. So what is Showtime and what are the differences with Theurgy? Showtime is a new combat mechanic that features a tag team of two characters to deal damage in a special cutscene type attack. Seemingly random, Showtime requires you to meet one of a set of conditions to initiate a Showtime attack, which the initiation is acquired randomly if those conditions are met. To list them all up, the conditions are: a party member obtains a baton pass, a party member loses 50% of their health or lower, a party member faints, a party member recovers from a status ailment, down or being knocked out, Joker is dying, Joker is down, an enemy is down, an enemy is critically injured, and rarely, an enemy is afflicted with a status ailment, a defense debuff, or if a party member has an attack buff. Showtime features different combination of characters with different cutscenes, but both characters are not required to be in a party. Only one character in the party for that particular Showtime is enough to initiate it, and also the damage is calculated mainly through the involving character's level and dealing piercing physical damage. So assuming all characters' levels are the same, they will mainly deal similar damage every time. Aside from the obvious two character requirements, the main difference between Showtime and Theurgy is the initiating conditions, Showtime being through a set of conditions and is initiated randomly after one of those conditions are met. Instead of the Theurgy gauge mechanic, where you manage a gauge through playing the game, it is more so randomly given to you for either playing the game quote-unquote properly, or if you get unlucky in some scenarios. With the nature of Showtime being random, even if Showtime as a whole helped Persona 5 Royal to be a fairly easy game, Showtime felt like a cool supplement to the gameplay rather than an overpowering system. For example, one of the conditions for Showtime is when the enemy is critically injured, where a few more normal hits could have finished the job. But Showtime initiates and you get a free Showtime attack. The first thing that would come to mind would definitely be, sure, why not, as you press the Showtime button. Another example scenario would be when Joker is unfortunately being targeted by the enemy, but not enough to kill him. A Showtime could initiate at this point to retake the advantage in battle. Even though healing Joker might be the best way to approach that situation in the first place, dealing with one enemy straight away with Showtime is one valid way to minimize the damage that could have been taken in the next following turns. It's a nice strategic addition that doesn't overpower the pre-existing strategy. With all of the problems of Theurgy and an example of a better system in Showtime being laid out, here are what I think could have been the solutions or improvements for systems like Theurgy potentially in later titles. I have to preface this that I am not a game designer. These are my opinions of the matter from playing Persona 3 Reload, Persona 5 Royal, and also Persona 4 Golden, and also with me coming up with solutions I do not mean to degrade any work that the game developers at Atlus had done to these games. While not perfect, these are some of my personal favorite games. I only intend to give out my opinions on this problem to possibly open up a discussion to other players with the same passion for the franchise as I have. If it did, then I hope the developers at Atlus will probably see this discussion on the internet so that this problem seemingly is fixed for future releases that have similar systems. First thing that I want to lay out though, Persona 5 Royal's Showtime is not overpowering the gameplay strategy of Persona 5 Royal. This is because of the random initiation system that they use instead of the fleshed out Theurgy system with their gauge. At first, I thought laying out the differences of Showtime and Theurgy could possibly spell out a solution for Theurgy, but because the main problem of Theurgy is the execution of the Theurgy and not from the initiation system, the comparison gives no tangible solutions for Theurgy because the Theurgy gauge is not random. However, during my analysis of the Theurgy system, some of my actual suggested solutions are: Number 1. Remove pierce resistances in offensive Theurgy skills. Offensive Theurgy skills shouldn't ignore resistances. Offensive Theurgy skills already had amongst the highest damage scaling in the game, on top of the already non-existent cost that it required. Making them ignore resistances makes these offensive Theurgy skills require no consideration to how you cast them, as enemies can't have a counterplay against them. Enemies can't block them, they can't reduce the damage taken from being resistant to that element. As a result, there's no strategy to how and when you cast Theurgy in general, encouraging players to spam Theurgy attacks whenever it is available. As a first to the changes of the Theurgy system, offensive Theurgy skills should not be able to pierce resistances. Number 2. Theurgy skills should have SP or HP cost. The removal of the pierce resistance effect wouldn't really discourage players to spam Theurgy whenever it is available, with the Theurgy gauge being able to regenerate pretty fast whenever you play around characters' gauge conditions, which is heavily encouraged due to their coherence to each character's kit. Basically, Theurgy feels like they don't have any cost for casting them. So, Theurgy skills should also cost either HP or SP on top of the Theurgy gauge cost to further encourage players to use Theurgy skills whenever it is mostly needed to gain the advantage in combat, rather than spamming them whenever it is available. It encourages a more strategic approach in combat the same way as weakness exploits, and the one more system that Persona holds firm. Also, even though I mentioned the second reason Theurgy exists being to alleviate some of the SP drought problems, I think that part of the benefit of the original Theurgy is highly unnecessary. Running out of resources should happen in the game. It should be natural to pose as a restriction to a player's limit and possibly as a challenge for players to make more strategic decisions. To how much the scaling of the cost should be, the HP or SP cost shouldn't cost a lot more than the highest level of skills, because in technicality, Theurgy gauge is already a requirement, so adding a high HP or SP cost is overkill, making it not worth the cost at all. I'm thinking for SP costs on magic related Theurgy skills to be around 20 to 40 SP on top of the Theurgy gauge, while HP costs on physical related Theurgy skill to be around 20 to 30% of max HP on top of the Theurgy gauge. Number 3. Introduce Theurgy altering mechanics to the enemies. As of right now, enemies do not have any quote-unquote counterplay against Theurgy other than straight up killing the party members. This is a huge stretch of a rework, as this definitely needs a lot of work and testing, but I think it would be interesting if enemies have a way to reduce a character's Theurgy gauge. For example, Theurgy Drain as a skill that a few number of special shadows could have. Similar to Life Drain or Spirit Drain, Theurgy Drain in my prototype will drain your character's Theurgy gauge by a certain amount and convert it to HP and potentially SP if that enemy has an SP pool. Conversely, Theurgy Drain could be added to either accessories or as a learnable skill to characters so that they can drain an enemy's HP and SP and then convert them to Theurgy gauge as an alternative to a better gauge gain on top of the gauge condition. Other than that, status ailments could also directly affect Theurgy gauge gain, like Fear for example. A lot more interesting combat effects could be applied and tested to make enemies have a better chance against characters with Theurgy, but for now, those are some of the examples that could happen for the Theurgy system. And number 4, add special effects unique to the characters on top of the attacks. With how much I have nerfed the Theurgy attacks, the purpose of Theurgy attacks now is only for nuking enemies that you are certain to have either a weakness that you can exploit and get a 1 more of, or on a neutral resistance enemy that could make it enough to kill them with a Theurgy. To me, this is no more beneficial than a normal high-level offensive skill. So to leverage that, I would suggest to add more special effects on top of the offensive Theurgy skills that should be either on theme or coherent with the character's whole kit and Theurgy passive. I personally think that adding a completely unique effect exclusively for one system is a great way to encourage players to use that system even if they are not highly overpowered. In this case, adding a unique effect that no other offensive skills have would make offensive Theurgy skills a lot more interesting and encourage players to use them. Some of the examples I listed out are Yukari, Cyclone Arrow. On top of the wind damage to one enemy, it will also heal all allies for a small amount and cleanses all debuffs from all allies. This is to encourage a more reactive strategy to use Theurgy instead of Yukari only being used for her second Theurgy skill. It focuses more on the recovery aspect of Yukari's kit and an additional Dekunda effect since she doesn't have a Dekunda in her kit. This way, you can safely use her Theurgy for both offensive and defensive scenarios. Junpei, Hack and Blast. On top of the high slash damage, it will increase the critical rate and damage of Junpei's next 3 physical attacks by a significant amount. This will encourage Junpei's whole gimmick to land critical hits on his physical attacks. For his second Theurgy skill, Blaze of Life, I would keep it the same, except change its damage to fire physical damage instead of fire magic damage. Admittedly, this is a concept originated from Metaphor Fantasio, but I think this would make for a neat Theurgy for Junpei as it can gain the critical hit benefits. Akihiko, Electric Onslaught. On top of the high single target damage, it also gives himself Hit Riser, complementing his Theurgy gimmick being around buffs. His first Theurgy, Lightning Spike, is fine as it is, but I think that should be the Theurgy that has a higher shock chance to enemies rather than Electric Onslaught. This is to encourage you to use Lightning Spike for the shock effect, while using Electric Onslaught for better damage and also refreshes Akihiko's buffs by getting Hit Riser. Electric Onslaught could also be changed to deal electric physical damage instead, but it's not as important as the previous changes. Aegis, Orgia Mode and Maximum Firepower. They should be fine as it is, but with the removal of the Pierce Resistances component from my suggestion and the HP cost of Theurgy skills now, Maximum Firepower I think should retain the Pierce Resistances, while Orgia Mode is fine without the Pierce Resistances as it still has the whole Orgia Mode gimmick to gain increased damage dealt but lose direct control. Maximum Firepower would be used for nuking a single target unconditionally with very high damage, plus the piercing resistances became an interesting thing now since no one else has it now other than Aegis. The HP cost for Orgia Mode should be around 15% max HP, while Maximum Firepower should be around 25% max HP. Koromaru's Hound of Hades should deal both fire and dark damage and has a chance to insta-kill enemies. Due to the removal of piercing resistances, the fire and dark damage should read the enemy's lowest resistances to either fire or dark and use that multiplier to Hound of Hades' damage. For example, if the enemy is weak to fire but resistant to dark, the whole damage would exploit the weakness. Also works vice versa. If the enemy is weak to dark but resistant to fire, the whole damage should also exploit the weakness. This is to strengthen Koromaru's gimmick from his Theurgy gauge condition, to exploit weaknesses to gain Theurgy gauge. The insta-kill property of the Theurgy is just a nice addition to the already powerful skill. I think because insta-kills were either light or dark, for Hound of Hades, the insta-kill component should be dark based, which means if the enemy blocks dark, it shouldn't have a chance to insta-kill. But if they are weak to fire, it should still gain the increased damage from the damage side of the Theurgy. This way, Koromaru has a stronger distinction to when you want to use which Theurgy on Koromaru, either to exploit weaknesses or to buff allies with charge. Ken, Divine Intervention, I think is fine as it is as a supportive option for a Theurgy, but Divine Retribution could use more effects. My iteration, Divine Retribution would deal light damage to an enemy and checks how much SP Ken has after the initial SP cost. If Ken has more than half SP, Ken would consume more SP to guarantee an insta-kill on that enemy or deal a percentage more damage if that enemy can't be insta-killed. If Ken has less than half SP, the Theurgy skill is enhanced to target all enemies instead, and has a property where the lesser the enemy count is in battle, more damage is dealt to the enemy. This way, it hones the magic damage dealer side of Ken with a lot more tools depending on Ken's SP pool. With more SP, insta-kill hones into Ken as a healer as well. While not direct, thinning out enemy count is a great way to minimize the damage you receive from enemies. A best offense is a good defense. I also included the additional SP cost to guarantee insta-kill to fit on Ken's Theurgy gimmick to have less than half SP to gain more Theurgy gauge. And with less than half SP, Ken should be rewarded for staying at less than half SP, which is definitely not optimal, especially for a healer. So I gave Divine Retribution a greater damage buff for both normal enemies and bosses with more damage against lesser enemy counts but spread out to more enemy counts. This way, Ken actually had an incentive to go for less than half SP, and also had a good way to accelerate going for less than half SP. And finally, Shinjiro with his sole Theurgy skill, Bleeding Fury, to consume 25% HP on cast to deal strike damage to one enemy, and also checks how much HP he has after the cast. If he had more than 50% max HP, consume 25% more max HP to deal a second hit. If he had less than 50% max HP, Shinjiro will gain a persistent Bloody Charge buff whenever he's below 50% HP for the next 3 turns. When I thought of this, I thought this is pretty overpowered, but since Shinjiro doesn't stay for long, might as well make the best of it. This would encourage players to keep Shinjiro at low HP, as his Theurgy gauge condition makes his playstyle the physical damage dealer that stays at low HP, but deals absurdly high damage. It's a risk and reward type of playstyle. I thought of making the buff be an incremental attack increase the lower Shinjiro's HP is, but I thought it wouldn't really work with the nature of physical attacks in Persona costing HP instead. And that's about everything that I can think of. There's definitely another way to improve the Theurgy system, which is why I opened this discussion to you guys, if you have an opinion on how to improve the Theurgy experience. At the end of the day, Theurgy was made to be a cool addition to Persona 3's combat. It adds a new flair to the characters, both their character design and their specialties. So no matter how your opinions are towards Theurgy as a whole, it made a great addition to Persona 3 Reload. Thank you for watching. I'm really grateful to you if you've made this far into the video. I want to quickly mention about my longtime sponsor of videos related to Atlas games, Figgies. I don't want to muddy up the discussion with a sudden ad read, but I still want to mention this at the end. Figgies is a toy/figure type of collectible that aims to be compact and customizable. While small, they represent the characters well. Check them out at figgies.com with my coupon code Izanagi for a 5% discount above $50. And yeah, once again, the comment section is open for you guys to discuss about Theurgy, and thank you so much for watching.